Good evening, everyone. I'm Nayaswami Asha, and we are continuing with Swami Kriyananda's 26 Keys to Higher Awareness, and in the amazing way of things, we are now up to number 22, which I knew would happen when we started with one, but it's still always surprising. Time is such a very, very, very interesting phenomenon. I'm certainly not the first person in the world to ever think about it. And it's just... no matter how much you live in time, it still remains very peculiar, isn't it? And just you start in one place and you know what's going to happen at the end, and then it's still now. I have no really bright conclusions to draw from any of this. It's just the way I think. Whenever I take a journey, and I'm not traveling much right now, 2016 summer, but I've traveled a lot. And I always, whenever I would leave the house, as I was walking out the door, I would always visualize myself walking back in the door. Just to sort of keep, I don't know, the life is a dream sequence clear in my mind, that even though we were going to shift over for a time to another view, that it would all roll back to this view again. The longer I live on the spiritual path, which is as long as I live right now, it's... the complexity of it sometimes becomes really simple. The simplicity of it sometimes becomes really complex. There's just this never-ending experience of consciousness, and life gets more and more simply focused on the quality of that consciousness. And everything else is extremely complicated at times, but not really. Flow of energy. Well, I'm going to come back to some of that with, I hope, more clarity than I've offered to you right now. Now I'm just running stream of consciousness with a camera running. So, number 22. Work with others, not against them. Be supportive rather than antagonistic in your dealings with them. I knew what the subject was today, and then it wasn't until quite recently that I picked it up, and it's really short. It's really hardly anything is written on there. I was hoping for more words to parse apart, but it's all right there. I think that my whole entire experience of my life with Swami Kriyananda, which was from, I met him in 69, I began to live closely with him in 71, and now it's 2016, and he died in 2013. His physical death hasn't changed the fact that I still live with him. But it changed it in that we couldn't email or talk on the phone or visit in person. That's a fact. But even just by very definition, I was his friend, he was my friend. Is the more operative word. He was my friend. No, he was a friend to me, very deeply. And that was everything about who he was that he was always supportive of people on a very extraordinary level. I don't even know where to begin. I remember in a certain context, Swami was summarizing for me an interaction he'd had with someone, and he was just kind of being quick with it to give me an idea of what the interchange had been. And so then he said, so I said this, and I said this, talking about himself. And then he said, but it sounds accusatory the way I'm saying it now, he said. And he said, but I'm never accusatory. And I thought about that for a very, very long time, and that was true. Swami was never accusatory. He never spoke to you in such a way that you felt that it was already a foregone conclusion, that he was coming at you because you'd done something wrong. He was always supportive. So even if the end of the conversation was, it did have to come out that perhaps you had done something wrong, and it now had to be dealt with, but you never got the feeling, I never got the feeling with Swamiji, that his mind was made up. So you felt like you could just be there, and whoever you were, and he would observe and comment, and he didn't hesitate to tell the truth. To be supportive of people is by no means to agree with them at all times. He he had a single responsibility, and that responsibility was to help people increase their awareness. And it was very interesting in all the years of being with him and being with him in so many different circumstances. If people were not interested in having their awareness expanded or having their awareness expanded by him, he would just as happily sit and not say a word. And if there was no way to establish that kind of relationship with someone, he would use the phrase, "I'm not drawn to that person," is how he would put it sometimes. Because there was no interest in drawing from him what he had. And if you didn't want what he had no wish to impose it upon you. He was very supportive of our realities, and that was all. And he was like that with perfect strangers. I vividly remember this taxi cab driver in Goa, who was himself from Goa. And the last time we were in Goa was at least 10 years ago, maybe. Well, no, that's not true, but this took place about 10 years ago. And Goa is in India, it's a beach resort area. It's a little bit different than other parts of India because it was in the hands of the Portuguese up until actually into the 60s. Even after India became its own country, Goa remained in the hands of the Portuguese until they worked that out. So it's a lot of Catholic influence, and it's just different. And one of the things that happened in Goa was when Kashmir became unsafe, it started becoming tumultuous because of different people's opinions about who should govern. A lot of Kashmiris, I don't know why they went all the way from Kashmir down to Goa, but they did. So a lot of Kashmiris moved into Goa, and the Kashmiris are business people, and they have these extremely fine handicrafts, and it's their kind of culture. And so a whole lot of the tourist businesses began to be dominated by Kashmiris. And in fact, the whole thing came up because we got into the taxi, and the Swami asked immediately to go to this particular store that was run by Kashmiris that were friends of his, and he wanted to go see them. And then the taxi driver complained that all the tourists go to the Kashmiri stores, and why don't they go to the Goan stores? And then he started doing as people do, playing the victim. You know, they've come and they've spoiled this and they've spoiled that. And we used the same taxi cab driver repeatedly until this cycle had completed itself. And Swami immediately sees that this man has a consciousness that's not serving him. So he begins a conversation that went on for several taxi rides. And it was, gee, are there any native Goan crafts? And how much do your people work with these things? And do you have them set up in attractive shops? And what do tourists like to buy? And he was comparing what the Kashmiris had done with what the Goans truthfully had not done, and just trying to get the man to think about being solution-oriented. And sort of when Swami took that man as far as he could take him on that tract, then after that we started just, not even deliberately, but we started using a different taxi driver. It was just like he was done. But never in any of that did Swami turn to him and say, "You have a bad attitude," or even imply that he had a bad attitude. He just started chatting with him about what was really the solution to what the man was complaining about. In another context, I remember Swami went out to dinner with them, and this was in Italy. I mean, things with Swami happened all over the globe. Swami went out to dinner with a man with whom he had a business relationship. The man was a publisher and had some of Swami's books, and there was a friendship, but the friendship was started because of the business relationship. But of course, the publisher was interested in Swami's books, so there was some simpatico there. But the publisher was a pretty worldly man, and he was married, and it did not look like a happy marriage. And so he was out to dinner. I was not present. This was told to me by someone else. And the husband and wife, in that very sort of what I will call a jaded European fashion, were being very worldly and very unkind to each other. And afterwards, after the dinner was over and Swami left with the other man who was a friend from Ananda who was with him, the friend said to Swami, "Oh, so glad to get away from that couple. He said the negativity between them was so thick. And Swami sort of looked at him and said, "Was it?" He said, "I never noticed." Now, it's not like Swami to not know what's going on around him, but here's what was so interesting. But then Swami reflected on it and realized that his entire conversation, the whole focus of his conversation, had been to continually try to take their difference of opinion and to resolve it into harmony. And he just constantly kept offering them solutions. But what was so interesting was that Swamiji never even called it negativity. And that's what he saw too. He just responded with uplifting positive energy. He was in a situation where uplifting positive energy was needed, so he just gave it. And he never thought, you're being bad, you're being unkind, you're being this. And so the level of support went so far that he never saw anybody making a mistake as such. He never held people to you're wrong, you're limited. He just essentially saw where they were, you might say, on the spectrum of consciousness and tried to coax them forward. Swami once said that all sentient beings, I doubt if he used that word, but he just said all beings, he said to him, and then he said even animals, he said they're just individual jivas, which again, he didn't use that word, but that's what he meant. Individual souls, and jiva is the Sanskrit word for that, on the spectrum of awareness between self-realization and as far down as the animal level. And they're just individual souls struggling for freedom. So wherever they are on that spectrum, he would just do his best to pull them forward. And of course, some were more receptive, and because of his destiny, his own assignment, the majority of his life was spent trying to help those who already had some degree of spiritual awareness to move them forward. Like he said when his cousin said to him when they were still in college, his cousin said that she would like to become a doctor. And Swami reflected on that for a while. And then actually I think that was when they were adolescents that she said that. He reflected on that for a while and he said, well, actually his interest was to make well people better, not to make sick people well. And it's interesting because it's just two different ways. Swamiji saw in the milieu in which he grew up, which is his father was ultimately, I believe, a vice president in Standard Oil, which became Esso, I think. And it was at the time that his father held that position, it was the oil companies, they hadn't been vilified like they're being vilified now. It was really a rising industry that was beginning to bring about huge, and at that time perceived to be enormously positive changes. So his father was actually quite a pioneer in an important opening field as an oil geologist, and rose high in that company. And all the people that his parents associated with were highly successful and accomplished people. So Swami looked at, he spent some of his childhood, we spent the early part of his childhood in Romania and England and Switzerland, but then when he was 13 he came to the US, but then the family settled in Scarsdale, which is a very high-end suburb of New York City. His father then started working in New York City and the family lived in Scarsdale. It still is a very high-end suburb. I went recently to visit, and it's about as nice as it gets living in America from the point of view of material comfort and those things that you can have for yourself if you have the material resources to have them. I myself live in Palo Alto, Silicon Valley now, and have lived here for, not quite 30 years, but getting close to it. And I moved here from the mountains of Grass Valley, which is Ananda village outside of Nevada City. And I lived very simply, although by the time I left I had a small but very nice little house. But prior to that I lived in trailers and small cabins, and very much separated from material success. Material success was defined only in the capacity to build the community and to establish it and to make it a beacon of light for the world. That we were working hard to manifest on the material plane, but it wasn't. It wasn't based on the personal wish for that sort of thing. And then I moved to Palo Alto, where this is my own characterization of it. And I have to add, I like living here, and I've always liked living here. I like living here because people are very creative, extremely creative. I mean, world innovation is where we live. So these people are, Steve Jobs said it perfectly. I'm not going to do market research to see what I should manufacture because they don't know they want it until I invent it. And of course, he was the quintessential Silicon Valley man, but that's the spirit here. It doesn't matter what's been done. It's what can be done. What could be done. What shall we do? And the other thing I love about this area, and it's a very important point, is that so many people here are self-made, that there is, meaning they didn't just, it's not old money. It's not the third generation of people who've been managing the family portfolio. These are people often who just started with nothing and then just sometimes made, well, it's almost appalling amounts of money by this point, but still made the money themselves, which is to say that there's a link in people's minds between creativity, energy, and prosperity. And that makes people adventurous. And in the spiritual field that I'm in, adventurousness is extremely important. You have to have imagination to be on the spiritual path. Otherwise, you take life as it is. Hasn't crossed your mind that, hey, this whole thing is just Maya. It's not really here at all. I have to think completely beyond the obvious. That's required to become a self-realizationist. But in any case, moving here, when I first was living here and my friends would come down from the mountains and visit, and we were pretty country bumpkin-ish without being at all that way, because Ananda people are very sophisticated and intelligent and educated. By no means are we bumpkins. But we lived a very simple life. So you come to this area, I would say to my friends, just ask for it, whatever it is. It's available within 10 minutes of this house, I promise you. Any material object, any food, anything that you desire, we can go out and just get it. And at that time, at a fairly reasonable price. And I felt like, this is how I described it, Palo Alto is the last desperate effort by intelligent, educated, refined, artistic, creative people with good taste to see if they can find satisfaction on the material plane. So it's a great place to be, because there it is. It's done about as well as it can be. And so Swami Kriyananda grew up in that, where it was done about as well as it could be. But the startling thing, and Swamiji said this, it's very interesting to contemplate. He said, we learn something from having our desires disappointed, but we learn more from having our desires fulfilled. Strange thought, isn't it? Because if you don't get what you want, it lingers in your mind that if I got that, I would be happy. And so you keep coming back, trying to make that happen. But when your desires are fulfilled, you realize that it's still not enough. And that's what moves you toward God, is when you realize, I have everything I'm supposed to have. I have everything that Maya told me would be enough. And lo and behold, it's not. And there's more suicides among rich people than there are among poor people. You would think that poor people, being so miserable, they would just kill themselves. But I'm not wanting to deal in stereotypes here, but if you still think if you get this you'll be happy, then you haven't reached the end of the road. There's no point in taking your life. You may be discouraged, but you'll keep trying, or you'll hope that your children can succeed. But when you have it all, and you realize that it's still not enough, that's when despair really sets in. That's where Swamiji's desire to take well people and make them truly well, which is transcend ordinary wellness into superconsciousness, actually. Now, all of this relates to what the story is today about getting along with people, because that fundamental understanding on Swami's part of everybody just being on a spectrum of consciousness, that, my only role in life is to expand people's awareness, to bring them to a greater state of consciousness, all of those things makes him on the side of everybody. As he put it at the end of his life, he had a very vivid dream in which he said he saw all the different kinds of people in the world, from very spiritual people to criminals to poor and rich. It was just a panorama that came to him it was a super conscious dream. And he realized that no matter what, everybody was seeking bliss. Everybody had one motivating force, and that was this implanted within them as inherent to our own nature desire for bliss. And Swami said in his superconscious dream, he realized that everyone was lovable, because no matter what surface thing they were doing, that poignant longing was really all that was going on within them. And Swamiji's capacity to just put aside all superficial, their personalities, whether they're being kind to him or not, whether they respect him, anything. But if they want, and I guess the word respect is there because they have to respect what he wants, or else there's nothing external that he can do. He can still bless them in his heart, but there's nothing he can do for them if they're not receptive to what he has to give. But that just makes it the same. You look at someone, and even if they're in terrible trouble, meaning that they've behaved very badly, what difference does it make? They're still seeking bliss. Many, many years ago, we received a phone call from a man who was imprisoned. And being in prison, he really wanted, he'd read Autobiography of a Yogi, and he really wanted to learn to meditate. And a lot of people in prison are innocent, and some of them actually are innocent. I've come over time to believe this man is. I know that he is. But it didn't matter whether he was innocent or not. He was in prison and he was in trouble, and we had what he needed. And so we just reached out to give it to him. Because if he's terribly guilty, if he's guilty and as accused and is a terrible criminal, he needs to move forward. And if he's innocently imprisoned and needs a way to cope with very tough karma, he needs a way to move forward. When is it not so? I remember in a certain circumstance, during the time that Ananda was being litigated against by our sister organization. The spiritual groups are always persecuted by other spiritual groups. They're rarely persecuted by anyone else, although the communists do persecute all religious groups. The heavy-handed communist regimes were and are still very tough on spirituality. But this kind of persecution often happens because of theological disputes, and that's what we were under. And there was a cycle of character assassination when all else failed. And Swami was accused of very unpleasant things. Falsely accused, entirely so, but accused. And some people were quite rattled by that. And Swami's response was very interesting. First he said, you've been living with me and have known me for so many years, and you're taking the word of complete strangers over mine. And that in itself was, why are you doing that? But the second thing is, he said, there's either two explanations here. Either I'm innocent, or I'm not guilty as accused. And therefore, loyalty would be an appropriate response. Or I am guilty as accused, and therefore I'm in trouble. And if you're my friend, if I'm in trouble, is the time when I would need your friendship the most. It's a completely different way to look at it. Instead of saying, well, I don't really like you anymore, I'm done with you. That's how people behave in this world. I talk to, and this is somewhat generational, and I'm not even qualified to say whether this is true. But so I'll just present the story as it was told to me because it was interesting to me. This woman had had a 30-year career in one company. And she'd aged in place. She'd gone in her 20s and now she was in her 50s. And the team had worked together. The team had solidified a long time ago. And they had a very strong relational organization because they all knew each other. And then the original manager who'd been through the whole thing with them retired. The new manager was 30. So a wholly different social group. And his whole way of relating, and this is how she described it to me, is that whereas she had grown up professionally in a time when you developed long relationships, you found your place and you were loyal to it. He had grown up in a time where you change your job every couple of years and that's how you're expected to progress. And the difference was that she had grown up in an age of relationships, and he himself said he'd grown up in an age of alliances, in which alliances are formed, and as long as they serve, we keep them, and as soon as they don't serve, we break apart. It's just different ways of living. It's not having myself. I entered a community when I was 24, and I'm still in it. I've had the same. I have this, Guru-Bhai relationships. Guru-Bhai means brothers or sisters in the Guru. Guru-Bhai relationships are not even for one incarnation. If you become the disciple of a Guru, and those who are also disciples of that Guru, you're together forever until everybody is liberated. I don't mean you have to hang back until everybody is, but you will keep repeating these for incarnations, whereas many of the close relationships you can have in one incarnation may not have that kind of substance at all. So the other factor in the way Swami has related to us and taught us to relate is these are soul friendships. And we have to work it out with each other. It's much more than marriage. Marriage is two beings in that particular incarnation, and there's an alliance, a marriage, that can go on for the whole incarnation. It may start up again, other incarnations too, but the form of it is just one incarnation at a time, until death do us part. But Guru-Bhai is life after life after life. So this idea of really learning to be supportive, which is what Swami says, work with people, see where they're trying to go and help them to go there. Swami was so skillful at understanding where you were trying to go. I was just reading this in regard, Swami was talking about the leaders of Self-Realization Fellowship, and he was talking about Dayamata particularly, and about the group of women who were close to Master during Master's life. Dayamata, Mrinalini Mata, Ananda Mata, and a few others. And they lived very closely with him, Durga Mata also, and they took care of him. Their life was with him. And Swami was talking about the difference between, and that, he said, Master was extremely grateful for their completely selfless, serviceful loyalty to him. And Swamiji talks about people, when a master comes in, that people are born to help him with what he has to do. In other words, to provide the energy. Swamiji put it once very sweetly. He said, yes, I or a person can get a lot of energy from inside, meaning from my connection with God, but it's nice to also get energy from other people. And he didn't mean to take it, but to have people be supportive friends. How can I help you? I mean, everybody feels that way. How can I help you? And what would you like for dinner? How can I pack your suitcase? What can I do to make it work for you? And Master had a strong group around him, mostly women, who had that kind of relationship with him. And he was deeply grateful for it. Swami said there was another category of person, which was he himself. And he said, and it's interesting the way Swami put it. He said, who saw Master, of course, for himself, but saw Master's mission and the expansive work that he came to do, that Swami's loyalty was to what Master was trying to accomplish. And Master, of course, was the center point of that, but Swami's own nature was out toward what Master was trying to accomplish. Swamiji himself says that when he came across the country in 1948 after reading Autobiography of a Yogi in New York City, and as he says, not wanting to act too hastily, he waited one whole day from the time he finished the book until he got on a bus and crossed the whole country to go to Master and ask to be his disciple. But he said as he was crossing the country, even before he'd even met Master, he'd only read Autobiography of a Yogi. He had two thoughts. One was, for himself, finally, I found what I'm seeking. And the other thought as he's going across the country is, I must tell everyone. And it was just right there. So when Master saw him, Master knew what he had in him because it was Swamiji's own inclination. If this is wonderful, I have to tell everyone. And of course, Master's only reason to come was to tell everyone. And Swami immediately linked into that. And, male and female may play a part, but it's really not so much that. It was just that Swamiji wasn't there to take care of Master. He was there to take Master's message out to the world. And it was just so self-evident to him that this is what he should do. And Master immediately started training Swami for that. Whereas the women who were taking care of him, he didn't train them for the mission because they weren't inclined that way. And, I thought of it, and this is about myself personally. When I first came to Ananda, very, very soon after I came, I was cooking in the kitchen, but very soon after I arrived, Swami pulled me into call it his world. His world was very small at that point, but he started having me work more closely with him, and eventually for 4 or 5 years I was his secretary. I always had other jobs at the same time because he was writing, and his life wasn't as big as it became, where one secretary wasn't even enough. But correspondence and appointments and travel plans, and at that time I also cooked and did other things too. But at a certain point, and I that was it. I had died and gone to heaven, and I had my little notebook, and I walked around all the time. I wrote down what he said. I took notes on what he said, and I mean, I took notes of his conversations just for history, and wrote down everything he wanted me to do. And I just thought, I was in my 20s, I thought that I would just do that until here I died. I would have a notebook and a pencil, and that was my life. And then at a certain point, after 5 or 6 years, whatever it was, he started sending me off to do something else. And he just said, it's like, this isn't what you were born to do. I said, how do you know? Doesn't my opinion count for anything? And it was good-natured between us because I didn't want to do anything else, I thought. But I knew he was telling me the truth. I also trusted him. I just said I really thought I was going to just follow you around for my whole life. I thought this was it. And then he said, you wouldn't be satisfied if you did that. And then I think I've said this even on this camera. I said, why don't we try and see? I'm willing to risk it. But he was sweet about it. But he said, no, you have something else to do. And of course, my mind goes like his, not like his, that would be presumptuous. But my mind trails 1,000 miles behind his, along the track that he's done. And I'm always thinking about how to tell people about this teaching. That's just who I am. Sometimes people ask me about preparing for classes, or now I have been doing this quite a long time, but even when I was doing it, when my tenure was shorter, but people would ask me about training. I don't know what the right word would be. And at this point in my life, the learning edge for me is not to have notes. It's not to make good outlines, which I did. I made very good outlines for years. I think it's very important to say that. But that's not where my expanding awareness is now. But I answer people. I prepare for my Sunday services. I prepare for these webinars. I prepare for every class I give all the time. I'm never not thinking about this. I'm always thinking about it, and I'm always trying to knit the pieces together and see how this relates to that, and how this illustrates this point, and how this can go along. And I don't have an off switch. I wake up in the middle of the night thinking about this stuff, and so it's who I am. And Swami just saw it, and he saw that this is who you are, and this is who you must be, and he pushed me out to do it. And now I'm 70, and yeah, he was right about I wouldn't be satisfied. I have no idea. How can you tell? But I've left a trail behind me of an awful lot of this, so it certainly seems like this is what I was supposed to do. Nothing wrong with an alternative to it. It's just who we are. Swami was trying to explain about Dayamata's leadership of SRF and the way she's a leader compared to the way Swami leads Ananda, and how completely differently they see it. How Daya is always saying, I was with him, I knew this is what he wanted. And Swami's always thinking, as he put it really simply in the same conversation that I'm quoting from here, which was just a conversation with me. He said, if Master were here now, he'd be doing things differently. When Master arrived in America, to make a correspondence course out of spiritual teachings, correspondence courses were brand new at that time. It was like a whole new idea. And it was hot stuff to do a correspondence course, and it was a real innovation for him to do a correspondence course of self-realization. It was the cutting edge of creativity at that point. And so right now, what would Master do now? Sitting in this reality, he would look at what the potential is, and he would start moving out into that potential. It's not that SRF never did or anything like that, but it isn't so much what he did is what was he trying to accomplish, and what are the means to accomplish that? Because Swami's entire temperament is, how can we reach people? How can I re-express these teachings in a way that will communicate with them? And long story. Swami got married for a period of time in his life because marriage was ordinary life, as he put it, bringing spirituality into an everyday life. That was and is the need of our times. Monasteries always are required and are have a power behind them that cannot be ignored. But the need of our time, the trajectory of our age, is not world renouncing; it's world involving. And Swamiji just had made the Ananda communities. He pushed it that way. He worked with always. He always worked with just exactly what. He's saying here today, work with people. Just look at what is happening. When I first moved to the Palo Alto area, and I had been 16 years at Ananda Village living, I traveled. I had already started traveling before I came to live here. So I'd been moving up and down the West Coast and had a lot more experience outside the ashram. But my life was still really centered in idyllic is the only possible word I can use to describe it, with deeply sincere spiritual people and saints. I lived in the company of saints. I've been privileged my whole life to live in the company of saints. Thank you, God. My Guru Bhais are breathtakingly beautiful souls. My new Guru Bhais, newly met in this lifetime, my childhood Guru Bhais, my spiritual childhood Guru Bhais, all of them. And I moved into a very materialistic age where lots of people had lots of agendas. And for a long while everyone was measured by, the peak of spiritual commitment that I'd had the privilege of living in for more than a decade. And it was hard. It was hard for people to measure up to that. because it wasn't their karma. It wasn't. And one day I just realized just how unfair it was. I sort of flipped it. And I began to just be so appreciative of any spiritual interest, instead of so impatient with any worldly interest. And so I just began to be grateful, just to be supportive. Instead of being against what they're actually doing, just try to support what they are doing. Just see it in that light. It's very difficult when we're attached, and it's very difficult when we have our own agendas. And that's what blinds everybody. Swamiji's remarkable nature was because he had no personal agenda. He didn't need anything from anyone, and he didn't need anybody to be different than they are. He could help you to become happier. He could help you go toward your own goal, which in the world that we lived in was always a spiritual one. He could help you go where you wanted to go. Just as Swamiji perceived my nature more than I was able to perceive it, I would have just tucked in behind him. Saved myself a lot of grief. Just tucked in behind him like that. But he knew that wasn't going to be what I needed, whether I even wanted it consciously. He knew that my soul wanted it. But Swami had no, I started to say, Swami had no agenda. He didn't need us to be different. He knew we had all the time in the world. We have literally eternity. And if we mess up this lifetime or don't progress as much as we might, then we will the next time. And there's no amount of imposition of his willpower on us would help us one iota. The only thing that would help would be to just continually transmit divine magnetism that would help us awaken. So it was, well, it was extraordinary. There's simply no other way to put it. He just, and just to see someone be, so he was everybody's friend. I was involved in a project once that was extremely controversial. I thought it was a great idea. A small group of us thought it was a great idea. Other people thought it was the worst thing that we'd ever thought of. How could we possibly be thinking? And there seemed to be a lot at stake. And people were calling Swami like this. And he had this marvelous phrase when he would talk to people, and for various reasons. I'm not going to go into the whole story, it's just not relevant. But for various reasons he didn't want to take sides. Sometimes he would say. He knew if he said, I think this is the right idea, that would have been it. But that would have been imposing. Because people's doubts were sincere and not entirely unfounded. Because it was risky. And Swamiji's response to everyone was, I understand why you feel that way. I just loved that phrase when I heard it. Of course, I'm a wordsmith, so I can go into rapture about just the perfect expression. Swamiji and I often would laugh because I didn't do as much writing in my earlier life, but of course he did lots of it. But he would just talk about how delighted he would be when he would get the phrase just right. And you have to have that passion for words, but I understand why you feel that way was just a masterpiece. Because he did. He really did understand why they feel that way. He understood the validity of their point of view, or he understood what was motivating them to have that particular feeling, whether it was laudable or not. I understand why you feel that way. I don't want to say use that, because that sounds too manipulative. I've remembered that phrase in many circumstances and realized what an incredible comfort it is to say to someone, I understand why you feel that way. And you haven't agreed with them. You may then proceed to say all the reasons why you feel differently. But if you understand why someone feels that way, then, now we're all on the same side. Now we can all talk together, because I do understand. And then here's my point of view. I remember I had someone who was working closely with me who tended to make demands that were impossible, tended to be a little bit excitable and concerned about their own position, would often make suggestions or ask things of me that just couldn't be done. And I very inappropriately would essentially say no. But gradually, I started listening to Swami's teaching. And instead, I would say, wow, that would be so terrific, if we could do that. That would be so terrific if we could do that, if we could fund you to go out and travel to Hawaii and start a center over there. Wow, that would be terrific. I wonder if we're going to be able to. You just say yes first. It's a sales technique even, but that's not what I'm talking about. I understand why you feel that way. I understand why you think that's a good idea. I understand why you would want to do that. And then we're on the same side. Now let's see if we can. Whereas if the first thing you say is, no, we can't, then you're always fighting with each other. I'm not so good at this. So here's a disclaimer on number 22, because I'm very strong-minded in my point of view, and I've had to learn this. This has really been my learning edge, because my mind is so quick, and I have a lot of fire, and I just had to learn to. I understand why you feel that way. I've had a very interesting experience recently. I've gotten involved in a local organization, semi-political sort of social service. It's not my usual cup of tea, but it's not my usual purpose in life. Truthfully, I don't work in politics because there's no solutions there as far as I can see. I have a few times because Ananda has needed it, and I've been the next in line. So I did a bit of it when I lived at Ananda Village, a couple of projects. And so I find myself here recently just drawn into this little ballot measure, and I'm working with it, and I'm working with these people. I think God has put me there for a very interesting reason, because I'm sitting in a group in which there are a lot of cross currents of relationships and opinions and needs and points of view and all this other stuff. There's the people who are more tuned in and the ones who are not, and the more emotionally mature and the more emotionally immature, just all acting itself out. And I'm so outside of it. I'm participating, but I'm so outside of it. I don't know the people. I have no karmic history with anyone. I have nothing to prove. I don't need to succeed at this. I don't need anybody to think I'm competent. I have no agenda. And it's really interesting for me to observe myself observing without an agenda. And so the only thing that I'm trying to do is see where the energy's moving and see if I can push it forward. And I thought, wow, what if I could be that calmly centered and impersonal in my whole life? Wouldn't that be a gift to me and all the people around me? I had a moment. It's not, and I don't want to overstate my own failings, because I've gotten a lot better, thank you, Swamiji, from years of training. But nonetheless, I tend to have an agenda. However, whatever, I tend to not be as neutral as it would be desirable to be. Not be as completely centered and impersonal about the energy as it would be nice to be. I had a moment, sometimes our spiritual lives happen in the oddest way. I remember it specifically because I was walking up the stairs, not in the house I'm living now, but in this apartment I lived in then. I was walking up the stairs, and I was, as I was thinking, as I always do, almost always do, and I was thinking about what it would be like to be not afraid of anything. And I'm a bit high-strung, that's a fact. I'm not as fearful as some people are, but I have a whole host of fears, and I have really big fears, like being in a concentration camp or being tortured. Those are my real big ones, past life memories, especially being tortured. And by no means do I obsess about it, but from time to time I kind of lean into it a little bit, just to see if I can, what I would do, how I could deal with it. I'm sure it's a past life, and I think I've I've been on the edge of a lot of different kind of movements over many incarnations, and I suspect some of them have landed me in prison. And if you fear anything, you still have karma with it. It's one of the ways you can tell if you have karma is if you're afraid of it. I mean, you might think, of course, anybody would be afraid of being tortured, but Swami Kriyananda tells, toward the end of his life, he had a dream, and he tells it often. He had a dream. He told it often toward the end. He said he had a dream that he was going to be burned at the stake. And there he was going to be burned at the stake, and he said he was perfectly calm about it. He just knew that, yeah, it would be uncomfortable for a little while, and then it would be over. And so he said, in the way that dreams are, he was sort of tied up to the stake over here, and the faggots were piled all around him. And just on the other side, his enemies were having a dinner party, and they were laughing and passing out the food. And over here, he was being burned at the stake. And just before, I don't know whether the flames had actually been lit or not, but just before it happened, his friends came and rescued him, and so it didn't. And he said what was so interesting to him in the dream was that there was no change in his state of mind. When he thought he was going to be burned at the stake, he was perfectly accepting of that. And then when he was rescued, and he didn't have to be, he said, but his state of mind didn't change. Now, that's just there's no karma there. There's no fear. There's no response. There's no agenda. I mean, I would have an agenda. I'd rather not be burned at the stake. I'm afraid of it. What will it feel like? What will happen to me? There's karma there. So coming back to walking up the stairs, I was just contemplating, what would it feel like? I mean, to have absolutely no fear. Because even it's interesting, even as I talk about it here, I can feel it subconsciously. I can feel the tension subconsciously. Not merely of being burned at the stake, but, the long list of unpleasantnesses that it makes me anxious to contemplate. It's an actual vibration. I'm not one who can see the chakras, but that's what I'm feeling. I'm feeling the vrittis in the chakras, very conscious of it. And just for a moment, going up the stairs, it was like Master just gave me this gift, and all the vrittis completely disappeared, really, for a split second almost. It felt like it was so short, but it was so intense. And just, that's what it would feel like. To have absolutely no fear. And of course, to have no agenda, that's the same thing. When you have no agenda, that's to say, I want God's will, with no qualifiers. Just, I want God's will, and I'll just see where things are going. And that doesn't mean you don't participate. Master and Swamiji, tremendous willpower, tremendous creativity applied toward the commission they had from God. Swami worked so hard, even to the very end, but toward the end he'd done it. Master had given him a great work to do, and he'd done it. And there was a kind of, everything else is extra now. I've really done it, and I'll just pick up whatever pieces I can, but I've done it. So it's not as if you're without willpower or the force to manifest in the universe, which takes, a tremendous amount of power. But an agenda, by that I mean personal. I need things to be a certain way. I may be commissioned by God to manifest, that's different. But personally, I don't need. And then you're on everybody's side, because you can just look at them. What do they need? Which is stern or kind. And some people can't be stern. They can only be nice. I remember at a point in my life I had to learn to speak up with force. You would think now that I don't, but I did have to learn it. I just didn't have the nerve to stand up when it was required. And I had to learn, you don't always have to agree with people. You don't always have to be nice. You have to be truthful. You have to stand by what you know to be true. But you can still be on everybody's side when you do it. You're just on the side of truth. And there's nothing personal about it. There's no agenda here. And that's what we're working for. to be supportive of people is a very good leadership technique. To say, I understand why you feel that way, is a very good leadership method. But the real method is inner consciousness. I remember once someone came to Swamiji and talked about a leadership technique they'd learned, where if you're going to have to correct someone, you should first say a couple of nice things about them. And Swami's response was like this. He went just like this. But that's so manipulative. And then he said, and a sensitive person would see through it right away. It's just like, you know, you can pretend, and if you're completely clueless, or if you don't have any instinct for it, it doesn't hurt to have it written down for you like that. But that's not real support. Real support is, I really care about you as a child of God, and I want what's best for you. And that may still mean I can't give you what you want. And that's when I was learning with the person I was working with. Most of the time I could never give them what they wanted because they didn't have any common sense about what they wanted. And there was just no way that time, energy, and resources could be directed toward what they wanted. Or it was just too self-centered. It just wasn't possible. But I learned, instead of feeling that I had to get rid of that person and push them away, I learned instead to say, I understand why you feel that way. And I would love to be able to make that happen. And I would really like for you to find the happiness you're seeking. And that's what Swami was saying in his dream. Everyone's seeking bliss. And that's what unites us. That's what makes us all we're just one family. We're just all on this spectrum between what it felt like for that split second going up the stairs, when just the tiniest little crack of freedom just showed itself to me. And then my usual undercurrent of unresolved karma reasserted itself, you know, and God knows that by the grace of Kriya and the grace of the gurus, you know, it's dissolving. There's much less of it than there used to be, and that's all that counts. We're just moving up this. And what a gift to give to each other. I mean, if we really want at the end of our lives, sometimes some of those people who've had death and return experiences, one of the many things that they mention is, wow, what I thought was the most important thing was not at all the most important thing. That almost always the primary reality is, how much have we loved one another? That was Dr. Ritchie in his wonderful book, Return from Tomorrow. And he died of the influenza when he was in the army in the beginning or the middle of World War II. And he came into the presence of Jesus. And all Jesus said to him was, how much have you loved? And he was just a young man at that point, and he just kept trying to make excuses and just talk about something else. And Jesus, just with great love, kept saying to him, how much have you loved? And he had to just say, not very much. And then he just realized, what have I been doing with my life? And he came back into his body and has lived for a long time, may still be living. But from that point on, that was the question. How much can I love? How much am I loving? And even when firm action is required, one can always do it. I understand why you feel that way. And then this is what has to happen. But when people reach you like that, everything is different. And in our life review, when Jesus said, how much have you loved? He won't even have to ask, because he'll know and will know. I've loved, I've loved, I've loved. I've followed Dharma. And the first Dharma is, how much have you loved? How much have you really wanted to help others in the same way that you're seeking for yourself? That we're all moving toward bliss. And how can I help you expand your awareness? God, how can I be your instrument to help bring others closer to you? God bless you.